Good afternoon. My name is David Weissbrodt, and I have taught international human rights law and immigration law, among other subjects, at the University of Minnesota since 1975. I've also established the Human Rights Center and have been involved in the leadership of a number of international organizations. Along with my colleague Linda Chavez, I serve on the board of Global Justice. Linda and I have in common our work as experts in the UN Subcommission on the Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities, as well as our human rights work in Geneva, Switzerland. Linda was the U.S. member of the UN Subcommission for the period 1992 to 1996, when she was nominated by President G.L.O.B.A.L and elected by the UN Human Rights Commission. I followed her for 2 terms in the subcommission, having been nominated by President Bill Clinton and elected by the UN Commission for 1996 and 2003. As a UN expert, Linda served as a special rapporteur on sexual slavery and slavery-like practices during wartime, including internal armed conflict. Similarly, I worked on a UN subcommission study on the rights of non-citizens. Linda served as the head of George W. Bush's task force on immigration when he ran for president in the year 2000, and she later met with him on a number of occasions when he was president of the United States to discuss immigration reform. I have written several books on immigration law and human rights. From 1995 to 1997, Sosima Samuel Burnett, currently president and founder of G.L.O.B.A.L, was a law student and served as my research assistant at the University of Minnesota Law School. And while I served as a U.S. member of the Subcommission on Human Rights, she assisted me and lived and worked in Geneva, Switzerland to facilitate and support programmatic priorities during the Subcommission sessions, including research on a large number of topics, including Linda's study on systematic rape during wartime, the Middle East, the death penalty, indigenous rights, race discrimination, and procedural updates at the United Nations. My aim today is to provide a brief overview of the goals of the United Nations, governments, and non-government organizations as related to cooperation in solving the refugee crisis currently plaguing our world. The United Nations was founded after the world faced the atrocities and tragedies of World War II. In less than 6 years, the war between the Axis and Allied powers resulted in 80 million deaths, about 4% of the world's population. Confronted with this reality and seeking to avoid further disaster, the UN Charter eloquently states the purposes of the United Nations, and I quote, "To save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to humankind." At a time when the world divided itself deeply between the capitalist West and the communist East, this task was no easy objective. The 50 original UN members rallied around the goal of cooperation in solving international problems of an economic, social, cultural, and humanitarian character. The UN called for the member nations to unite in harmonizing their actions, in attaining and maintaining the collective peace and security of the world. Collaboration and cooperation in maintaining peace have certainly increased since the United Nations inception to as more members join. Currently, 193 states are members of the United Nations and thus members of the General Assembly of the UN. Numerous threats to peace and security of people have become evident over the years, including massacres of Tutsis in Rwanda, brutal civil war and genocide in Yugoslavia, the Korean War, Rohingya migrants fleeing Myanmar, political and social unrest in Sudan, the war in Syria, the displacement of Haitians from the Dominican Republic, and so on. All of these human rights challenges have prompted collaboration through the United Nations in ending violence, punishing perpetrators, and restoring peace. The UN is uniquely positioned to encourage collaboration between nations and international institutions, to develop standards for ending conflict and maintaining peace, to provide direct assistance to governments and affected individuals, and to challenge violations more effectively than any single nation could alone. The current crisis surrounding the uncertain futures of refugees, asylum seekers, and internationally displaced persons reflect pressing challenges to peace and security of millions of people all over the world. At present, nearly 60 million people are displaced around the world because of conflict and persecution, the largest number ever recorded by the United Nations. About 11.6 million Syrians, nearly half of Syria's entire population, have been forced to leave their homes. Most of them are scattered within Syria, but 3.9 million were living abroad by the end of 2014. Nearly all of them in Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. Beyond the millions who have fled Syria's immediate neighbors, Egypt has received the largest number of Syrian refugees, roughly 138,000 by December 2014. By 2014, many African migrants have tried to cross the Mediterranean to reach Europe. Most Africans displaced by conflict stay in Africa. About 15 million people are displaced in sub-Saharan Africa. That is, about 4.5 million of them fled in 2014. Long-lasting conflicts in Somalia, Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, as well as the civil war in South Sudan, are some of the top contributors. 60 million people are refugees today, asylum seekers, subject to trafficking, or are otherwise displaced from their homes. Accordingly, 1 in every 120 human beings does not have a permanent home or is seeking a new one. Close to half of those 60 million are children. If the displaced persons could form its own country, it would be one of the world's 25th largest nations. Many are resorting to extreme measures to reach safety. Refugees from northern African nations, for example, are making the treacherous journey across the Mediterranean Sea to reach South Europe. In 2014, more than 213,000 successfully made the trip. But the UN High Commissioner for Refugees has received reports of many other women, men, and children reported dead or missing in the Mediterranean Sea. The boat people, trafficked persons, and others subject to exploitation reflect a global crisis analogous to the human rights violations during World War II. Governmental, non-governmental, and international organizations, support groups, and advocacy collectives have responded to the current problems. The Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees is one prominent example. The UNHCR was established by the United Nations General Assembly. The agency is tasked with leading and coordinating international actions to protect refugees. It safeguards the rights and well-being of refugees and tries to ensure that everyone can exercise their right to asylum and find sanctuary in another country. The UNHCR has helped millions of disenfranchised persons to find new homes since 1950. Currently, the UNHCR employs over 9,000 people working in 123 countries. The efforts of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees since 1950 has extended to every corner of the world and have encouraged cooperation between governments as well as policy and lawmakers. By engaging governments and humanitarian organizations, the UNHCR seeks to one day achieve its ultimate goal, that is, universally, consistently applied and equitable protection of refugee populations as a durable solution to the problem. In its fight, the UNHCR is not alone. The Red Cross is based in Switzerland with the International Committee of the Red Cross, the League of Red Cross Societies, as well as national sections in many countries that provide humanitarian support during and after conflict, responds to national emergencies, supplies medical and psychological health care to individuals, finds and remits families separated by a war, and advocates for better and more favorable resettlement policies and projects. The Red Cross also provides on-the-ground support to refugees and asylum seekers by setting up systems in various countries to receive and accommodate refugees and asylum seekers. Locally in Minnesota, in what has become a hub for human rights advocacy, 3 organizations focus on identifying and helping refugees and asylum seekers in need. The Center for Victims of Torture aims to provide healing services to survivors of torture, more than half of whom are currently seeking asylum and refuge in the U.S. The Center for Victims of Torture has taken an active advocacy role in the U.S. Capitol in asking for more efficient, streamlined, faster, and fairer processes in reviewing and granting asylum, especially to those who are in danger of facing violence again. The Advocates for Human Rights, also based in Minnesota, provides legal aid, advocates for reform, and works to resettle and reintegrate refugees, asylum seekers, and other immigrants to their new communities. The Advocates for Human Rights hopes to achieve its goals by engaging both the local and the global communities in first recognizing and then fighting problems that threaten the peace and security of people. One such problem is the refugee phenomenon currently sweeping the world. The American Refugee Committee is a humanitarian, non-governmental organization centered in Minnesota that works in 10 countries around the world to help victims of civil war and strife rebuild their homes and their lives by providing shelter, health care, and legal aid to more than 2.5 million people each year. The ARC is focused on cooperation with governments and international bodies, such as the UNHCR, to bring about peace and security to affected populations. While many organizations and individuals are working to improve the status and brighten the future of refugees, asylum seekers, and internally displaced persons, no truly central body exists to tackle these problems full force, head on. At best, what now exists is a fragmented infrastructure that provides an inadequate response to a very serious global challenge. The UNHCR, various NGOs, and individual leaders are providing important contributions, but unless the metaphorical wound on human rights is stitched and not merely covered, the best case scenario is that only a small number of all those people who deserve our assistance will be helped. The UN has made some critical measures towards addressing these problems. Mainly, it has encouraged cooperation between nations facing an influx of refugees and asylum seekers by creating the UNHCR. Additionally, it has often managed to prevent, shorten, or eliminate war that may cause such an influx. However, it has not put an end to the problems that we described. It has attempted to put pressure on resisting countries such as the U.S. in inducing actions and policies for the protection of refugees that would lead to increased security and protection on a global level. Arguably, the United Nations has the power and the knowledge necessary to produce significant changes in how 60 million people are treated. It also has a clearly aligned goal to those ends, including maintenance of international peace and security. What stands between the UN and its goal is the politically charged nature of international affairs. Unfortunately, for the 60 million people searching for a new home, that barrier may be difficult to achieve in our lifetimes. Thank you.
Professor Weissbrodt, thank you so much for your remarks. And we have some questions that we'd like to relate to you about this global issue of the refugee crisis. The first question is, we currently do have the largest refugee crisis in history. Is there enough global discussion and collaboration on this issue? And if not, what more do we need?
Well, indeed, there is a very large refugee crisis in the world, and we're not doing enough to respond to that crisis. Now the question is how to bring together those resources and make them real for the people of the world who are suffering.
Great. And the second question then is a follow-up is, what should the role of developed nations be in addressing this global refugee crisis?
Well, developed nations such as the United States and Europe have greater resources than underdeveloped countries. But nonetheless, they have not been doing enough. And there is a real need here, which we're trying to draw attention to.
And do you consider the United Nations to be the most effective vehicle for addressing this issue, or do you see other IGOs or NGOs as also important for present and future issues?
The United Nations, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, non-governmental organizations such as the ones that I mentioned in my presentation are all important resources for dealing with this problem. But there's still much more to be done.
And then also, given the global political climate, what do you see as the greatest challenge, and in the alternative, the greatest opportunity for nations to collaborate in addressing global injustice?
Well, of course, the greatest challenge is the large refugee problem that we suffer all over the world, and particularly problems of trafficking and the suffering that refugees are suffering all over the world. Now the question is how to bring the attention of the world, international organizations, non-governmental organizations, and intergovernmental organizations, to bring them to a response to this grave problem.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.